Controversy. There has been much controversy over this passage in the book of James through the years. In fact, there has been more controversy over this passage, these verses in the book of James, than any other part of the book or the letter of James. And maybe more than the entire New Testament. There may be some passages on the end times and what happens and some understandings of Revelation that may kind of come in and challenge for that place. But this is a controversial passage. In fact, Martin Luther, the great reformer, said that he thought the book of James did not belong in the New Testament, in the Bible, because of this passage. But this is actually a key section of James's letter. James has been leading up to this, building up to this passage, or these verses. He has talked about pure religion or true religion. He has talked about being a doer of the word and not just a mere hearer of the word. And those ideas come to a head here in these verses. This passage is actually the centerpiece of his letter. This passage is the centerpiece of his emphasis on being a doer of the word and living out our faith in Jesus. So why the controversy? Well, because many people have misunderstood James and have accused him of contradicting the Apostle Paul. You see, Paul tells us very clearly that we are saved by grace through faith. And he adds to make it very clear, and not by works. We just read this passage, and James said something that sounded a little different than that. But Paul has been very clear that we are saved through faith and not by works. And when he says this, what he means by that is that we cannot earn our salvation. That we can't be good enough to be saved, to be right before God, because we are all sinners. We have all fallen short of the glory of God. We have all fallen short of his holy standard. And therefore there is nothing we can do to be good enough before God. And let me read you a few passages from Paul that say this. So Romans 4:5 says, "And to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness." Titus 3:5, Paul writes, "He saved us, not because of works done by us in righteousness, but according to his own mercy, by the washing of regeneration and renewal of the Holy Spirit." Ephesians 2:8-9 says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." No one can say, "I was good enough. I'm saved because I did this." That's not of works. The thing is, this is the true gospel. And we spent a lot of time defending this true gospel when we studied the book of Galatians just a few weeks ago. We are saved by grace. We are saved through faith alone in Jesus. But here's the problem. James talks about works and salvation. And people misunderstand that. Why? Well, the reason is because we are very familiar with Paul's writings. In fact, Paul wrote most of the New Testament. So most of us, when we think about the gospel, when we think about biblical things, we think about things Paul has written. That is what we are very familiar with. So we think like Paul. We understand his thinking, and we understand the way he uses words and the meanings and nuances that he uses for those words. And then we take that understanding from Paul's teaching and we read it into James. But James happens to be coming from a different angle, and he uses some words differently. And then, because we are reading Paul into James, we think they are contradicting each other. And you'll see what I mean. But in actuality, they don't disagree. Paul and James do not disagree with each other. Rather, there is no contradiction at all. Rather, their teachings actually fit together and complement each other. And so we start in verse 14 of James chapter 2. And James asks the question, can that faith save you? Verse 14. He says, what good is it, my brother, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? So he begins with the question, what good is it? And the question implies the answer, well, no good. It's no good. It's of no use. And he's saying that if you have faith but have no works, in other words, you don't live out that faith, that faith is useless. It's of no benefit to you. Now, before going any further, we need to talk about these words, faith and works. So, faith. When Paul speaks of faith, he is referring specifically to a trusting belief in God or in Jesus. In other words, I believe in Jesus and I'm putting my trust in Him for salvation. I am trusting that His death on the cross paid the price, so then now I am forgiven. But James doesn't have such a precise meaning of the word faith here. He uses it more generally. When he speaks about faith, it can refer to a trusting faith like Paul refers to. But it could also mean simply to give mental assent. In other words, to agree, to understand with my mind. So I believe something is true. For example, I believe that 2 + 2 = 4. But I'm not trusting in 2 + 2 = 4 for my salvation. You see the difference? So there's a trusting faith and there's just a mental assent. Yes, I believe that's true. I know it's true. And so James, when he speaks of faith, it can refer to either of those situations. And that's why he can speak of things like saying, that faith, or that kind of faith. Can that faith save you? Now, let's talk about the word works. In Paul's letters, when he speaks of works, they're spoken of in a few different ways. First of all, he will speak of works of the flesh, or sinful actions. Secondly, Paul speaks of works of the law, or works by which some people may try to earn salvation, or the works by which they think they now deserve salvation because of those works. And when he talks about those works, these may be good things. But Paul says that these works can't save anyone because we're all sinners. These are the works like in Ephesians 2:8-9 that we just read, that we are saved by faith, not by works, not by the good things that we do. And so he's very clear that those things cannot save you. But when he has that discussion, he sets works up as opposite of faith, as the two opposing, as in there are two different ways that people either try to be saved or are saved. There are the ways, one which cannot save you and one in which does save you. So we're saved by faith, not by works. And so Paul, when he uses works that way, he is talking about that we are saved apart from works. Well, then the third way that Paul uses works is he tells believers to do good works. And that he even says that we are to consider ourselves to be slaves to righteousness. In other words, that good works or righteousness is our master, that we are to serve, that we are to do those things. And so he says we are to consider ourselves to be slaves of righteousness. In other words, we live right. We live right as children of God. We live right as followers of Jesus. And this last way that Paul uses works is very similar to the way James speaks of works. You see, James is speaking about works that come with faith. Works are a natural product of true faith. And so a person who has faith will do good works. Now, James doesn't say that these works save us, but he says that saving faith is accompanied by works, or saving faith produces good works. And so if there's no works, then the faith must not be a saving faith. Okay, having said all that, we are now ready to read this verse again. Let's read it again. Verse 14. He says, "What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him?" So he's asking the question, if someone has faith or a belief that produces no works, can that faith save him? And by that faith, he's referring back to that belief that doesn't produce any works, that doesn't bring about any good works. And the form of the Greek question that James uses expects the answer, no. Can that faith save him? It expects the answer, no. It's like when we say something, we would say, that faith can't save you, can it? And you're expecting the answer, no. And so that's the kind of question he's asking here. And it implies, by saying that kind of faith, he implies that we are saved by faith, but a particular kind of faith. But it's certainly not that kind of faith. That faith that produces no works. Well, he goes on to make his argument, and he begins by showing that true faith is more than just empty sentiment. Look at verse 15 and 16. He says, "If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warmed and filled,' without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that?" Now, so he makes this illustration, and this illustration makes the point that mere lip service is meaningless. That if we see a fellow Christian who is in need, and we wish them well, but we don't help them, and the assumption is that we can, so we wish them well. I hope that you are warm. I hope that you have food. I hope that everything goes well for you. But then we don't do anything about it, even though we can. Then your well wish is meaningless. Your words are empty. You see, your words would suggest that you care about their well-being, but you don't really, because you're not willing to do anything for them. James is suggesting here that if you really wanted them to be warm and to be fed, you would help meet those needs. And so just saying, "Oh, I hope you do well," is just empty sentiment. So what good are your words? He says, no good. They're useless. And now here's the application of that illustration in verse 17. "So also, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead." He says it's the same with faith and works. If faith or belief, a belief, doesn't produce works, then it's like empty words. It's like useless lip service. And he says that kind of faith is dead. It's lifeless, it's useless, it's empty, and it's ineffective. It does no good. Well, he continues to show that this kind of faith is lacking. And he compares it to the faith of demons. First, let's read verse 18. He says, "But some will say, 'You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works.'" So James is making this argument, or suggesting that someone might come along and make this argument. Well, I have faith and you have works. And by that, the argument is expressing that not all people experience their faith or their religion the same way. The person says, well, you have faith, I have works. Kind of like, well, we experience it differently. The person is suggesting that one person's relationship with God may be mainly expressed with faith, and another person's may be mainly expressed by works. So the argument would be that just because we experience this a little differently doesn't mean that you should say one is right and one is wrong. That one is genuine and one is not. And James answers this with a challenge. And when his answer, he doesn't pit faith and works against each other, but rather he sets up a challenge between workless faith and faith that is accompanied by works. So a faith that produces no works and a faith that does produce works or life change in the person. So he says, one person may say that they have faith, but it's impossible to demonstrate it because there's no evidence. There are no works. So you can't demonstrate it or prove that you have faith. There's just a claim, and this begs the question then, is this saving faith? On the other hand, the person who lives out his faith is shown by his works. And so his faith is seen, it's demonstrated by his change to life. Now, the works themselves don't save this person, but the works are a natural result of faith. It's a natural result or outflowing of being made new, of being in a right relationship with God. And so James is saying that so if you're saved, there will be works. And his point is that faith and works are inseparable. They go together, they fit together, they work together. So a belief that doesn't lead to works is not a saving faith. And he says, let me give you some further proof. Look at verse 19. He says, you believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. James says it's a good thing to believe in God. It's a good thing to understand that He exists, that He is the supreme being over all others. You see, this is the kind of faith he's been talking about when he says, can that faith? It's someone who just simply believes that God exists, that there is a God, that He is greater, that He is above, that they believe in God. And he says, that's good, but it's clearly not enough. And it's clearly not enough because he compares that kind of faith, that kind of belief, with the belief of demons. He says demons believe God exists. Demons believe that there is one God. And they even fear Him. But they're not in a right relationship with God. They're not trusting in God. But these demons, he says, they shudder in fear because they know who God is, and they know that they deserve judgment, and they know it's coming. So they know it very well, but they're not trusting in God, and they're not in a right relationship with God. But here's the ironic thing, is that even those demons have some response as a result of their belief. They shudder. How much more should true faith result in good works? Well, James continues his argument and he says, well, how about faith like Abraham? Look at verse 20. He says, do you want me to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? So he says this again, that faith without works is useless. And this word useless literally means not working. Faith without works is not working. In other words, faith without works is a play on words. Faith without works doesn't work. And so he makes this very clear, and he says it does no good, it's ineffective. But basically he says here, I'll show you, I'll prove it to you. And he gives us two examples from the Old Testament. The first one is Abraham. Look at verse 21 through 23. He says, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. So James says, Abraham was justified by works. And when he says this, he's referring to the event that happened in Genesis chapter 22. When Abraham offered up Isaac on the altar to God. Now, if you remember the story, very strange story, one that many of us are uncomfortable because we say, why in the world did God ask Abraham to do this? But God told Abraham, I want you to take your son, your only son Isaac, who was the promised son, the promised descendant. I want you to take Isaac and I want you to take him up to the mountain and I want you to offer him as a sacrifice to me. And so Abraham said, okay. He took his son. He took a 3-day journey. He tied him up. He put him on the altar. And he was just about to kill his son. And God said, stop. And what did God say to Abraham? Now I know that you fear me. The point is, you have shown it. You have demonstrated that you have faith, that you believe, that you are obedient. He says, you have shown this. And so God says, now I know. The point is that his faith in God was demonstrated by his actions. He trusted God, and then God's statement made it clear that his faith was proven by what he had done. But the thing is, back in James also quotes from Genesis 15. Well, obviously Genesis 15 happened before, let me do this from your perspective. Genesis 15 happened, that was right, before Genesis 22. Okay? And so he quotes from Genesis chapter 15, and he quotes this, that Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. But see, James quotes these two because for him, they're connected. Abraham believed, in other words, he was declared righteous. It was counted to him as righteousness, declared righteous, and then it was proved by his actions. See, but James says very clearly, he says that Abraham was justified by his works. And when we hear that he was justified by his works, that sounds so wrong to us. Why? Because that's not the way Paul talks. And again, he's using these words differently. He uses the word justified in a different way than Paul does. In Romans 4:3, Paul quotes the same verse from Genesis chapter 15. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And when Paul quotes that, he quotes it to prove justification apart from works. Do you see this? So James is quoting there saying, look, see, he was justified by his works. Paul says, he quotes it and says, see, he was justified apart from works. And we hear that and we say, what? They sound like they're contradicting each other. But again, they use these words differently. Paul uses the word justified in a specialized way that was actually very uncommon, not very common anyways, except in the New Testament. Because in the New Testament, that is the most common way it is because Paul wrote most of it. Okay? And so he uses it in this way that's very, or not very common. And so when we hear the word justified, we think of Paul's definition of justified. That you are declared righteous. You see, Paul uses the word justified in a judicial sense of someone being declared righteous or declared not guilty. And so it's it refers to the decision of the judge. And so Paul's argument is, before Abraham proved or demonstrated his righteousness through works, God declared him righteous. He counted it as righteous. He declared him righteous. But see, James uses this word in the more ordinary sense of proving or showing that someone is righteous. And so James is saying that Abraham was shown to be righteous. He was shown or demonstrated to be obedient to God by his actions. And so his faith was proven or was made evident by his works. Now let's look at a few other things that James says in those verses. He says that Abraham's faith was active along with his works. And they were active together. They were working together. And that's what he means by that. They were working together. And his point is that faith and works, they go together. Abraham didn't just stop at belief. But his faith was expressed in works. And then James says that Abraham's faith was completed by his works. Now the idea here is that his faith reached its intended goal when he obeyed God. You see, faith, true faith, brings about obedience to God. Well, then James goes on and he says that Abraham's obedience fulfilled the scriptures. In other words, his obedience, his works, gave evidence of what was said earlier in Genesis chapter 15, when it said that his faith was counted as righteousness. So in Genesis 15, he was declared righteous. In Genesis 22, he was, in James's sense of the word, justified or shown to be righteous. His faith was made evident. So, James's conclusion, verse 24, you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And James' point is just that you are shown to be righteous. You are shown to be in a right relationship with God by works that are produced by your faith. His point is pretty clear in this statement. That faith, true saving faith, is never alone. It is always accompanied by works. You can't be right before God if all you have is a mental assent type of belief. Yeah, I agree, it's true type of belief. But true faith will produce works. True faith is lived out, and the believer is shown to be righteous by his works. Well, he gives a second example, Rahab. Very quickly, verse 25, he says, and in the same way, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messenger and sent them out by another way? You remember the story of Rahab? The children of Israel had been wandering in the desert. They were about to come into the land, and they're standing there, and Joshua sent spies into the land to check it out, and specifically to the city of Jericho. And so they went to Jericho. And when they went to Jericho, some people said to the king, hey, spies, some men have come from Israel to spy us out. And they're at Rahab's house. Well, she took and hid the spies. And she told them, I know that you're coming, and I know that your God is great, and I know that he's going to give you the victory. See, she believed who God was, And she believed that God was going to give them the victory. And because of that, she hid the spies. And she said, I'm going to help you. But when you leave here, remember me and my family. And so she hid them. And then the men came to the door and she said, oh no, they left already. And then she let them out a different way and told them, go here and wait and then go. James is making the same argument about Rahab here as he was about Abraham. That she believed in God and she was trusting in him. She believed he was going to be victorious. She believed the Israelites were going to take that city. And she believed that they would spare her life. But she believed in God. She was trusting in him. And her faith, her belief was proven when she risked her life to hide those spies and to help them. Her actions demonstrated that she truly believed. So James says, there's your evidence. And then he makes one last illustration and a summary statement, verse 26. He says, for as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. He says, if a body has no spirit, it has no life. It's dead. It's lifeless. It's empty. There's no life without a spirit. And he says, just like that, a dead body is just that. It's dead, it's lifeless. And just like that, in the same way, faith, a faith that doesn't produce works has no life. It's dead. It's useless. It can't do anything. It's no good. Now, let me make one thing as clear as I possibly can. Works don't animate or give life to your faith. Rather, because your faith is alive, you do good works. I'll say it again. Works don't animate or give life to your faith. They don't make your faith alive. But rather, because your faith is alive, you do good works. Works don't save you, but you work because you are saved. This is what James is saying in this passage, that saving faith, true faith, produces life change. It produces good works in the life of the believer. And now, just in case you're wondering, Paul would not disagree with what James says here. Earlier we read Ephesians 2:8 and 9 to show that salvation is by faith alone and not works. I'm going to read it again and continue on to verse 10. Paul says, for by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. That's where we got it. So faith, salvation is by faith alone, not by works. But he continues on in verse and he says, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus. Why? For good works. He says that's the purpose. That's the reason. You were created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. When we were called to salvation, we were called to do good works, to be obedient, to follow Jesus. We were saved to do good works. We were saved to be God's holy people. And James is saying, don't miss this. We are saved by faith. But faith that saves will lead to obedience. So, faith and works are not completely separate issues. In fact, they always go together. True faith results in a changed life and in good works. Again, and that doesn't mean that we're all going to be perfect, because what do we still do? Sin. And we grow at different rates. But true faith results in a changed life and in good works. Salvation is by faith alone. but that faith is never